Hi, morning everyone. Welcome to EL's webinar. We're going to be talking about the Muslim Brotherhood as a movement, indeed whether it is a movement or an organization, and many other things. It remains obviously the most controversial really of the Islamist groups because unlike other Islamist extremists, it has, there is a view that it is an outlet for peaceful Islamism and that it in a sense diverts people away from violence and extremism. The other side of the debate, of course, thinks that it's a gateway to these things. In late September, Yusuf al-Qaradawi died, and he was probably the most influential Sunni cleric in the world. He was also a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. And in some senses, he highlighted the complexities we're going to talk about today because theologically speaking, he was reasonably moderate. He advocated, for instance, the integration by gender of schools and things like that. He also advocated for suicide bombing against Israeli civilians. So it was very easy for people to be selective in their obituaries of him and say to emphasize whichever side they felt. And we're going to try and broaden that out a bit. We're also going to touch on the Brotherhood in Europe, which has been the center of an intense debate, especially in France and Austria recently, where the governments are trying to deal with a phenomenon that in some senses operates within the law, but operates within the law with an intention of undoing the law. And there are no very easy answers to that. So we're going to try to see if there's a way to square the circle. Our three expert speakers today are Dr. Sara Brzuszkiewicz. She is a researcher in the field of terrorism and radicalization. We have John Rossomando joining us from the US. He's a researcher in defense policy and intelligence matters. So we go to you, Sara, for the first round.
I share my slides. Okay, great. Do you all see them?
We do.
Yeah.
Excellent. First, good morning, everyone, and thanks to the friends in European Radicalization for inviting me. In these few minutes together, I would like to touch a few crucial points that can help us understand the current unique situation that the Brotherhood is experiencing. For those who are not familiar with them, we will see the most widespread radical discourses within the analyzed environment. Then we will see the major crisis that the Brotherhood is going through in the last few years or few months. And finally, the ways in which it is facing them, it is addressing this crisis, especially after the death of Yusuf al-Qaradawi, and the strategies that most likely the Brotherhood will put into play in the future. In the last few months of 2021, the mother branch of the Brotherhood, so the Egyptian one, has been showing signs of a sort of disintegration. A few weeks ago, the MB announced in a published document that they were overcoming their power struggles, the internal power struggles, but it's hard to believe so far. What was this power struggle about? Well, Ibrahim Munir, based in London, has been acting as the supreme guide of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood since the arrest of his predecessor, who was Mahmoud Izzat in 2020. Now, the division is based on the fact that the Istanbul-based Brotherhood leaders try to replace the London-based Munir with former Secretary General Mahmoud Hussein. Munir has announced the suspension of the Istanbul-based Mahmoud Hussein's membership in the Brotherhood and referred Hussein, along with some of his main allies, for internal investigation on the grounds of financial and administrative irregularities. Of course, the Istanbul Brethren are refusing to recognize Munir's authority. What we have to understand here is that beside procedural problems, however, it is clear that the internal discontent and the instability are growing, and part of the grassroots certainly has been blaming Munir leadership for this. So the weak status of the Brethren in Egypt the fragile image of them in Tunisia, for instance, and the increasing mistrust against MB-affiliated groups in the West are major problems that the Brotherhood does not really seem to be able to tackle, especially from the UK. This rift is interesting and experts should monitor it closely because displays of internal disagreement are very unusual for the Brotherhood, which has always presented itself as a very cohesive and monolithic movement. It is therefore easy to understand that if the disagreement somehow came to light, it means that it was or it is quite deep. Hussein also went on, so the Istanbul branch went on to claim the title of acting supreme guide for himself and received support not only in Istanbul, but from some members also in the UK. At the same time, however, in London, Munir seems to have control of some of the main Brotherhood institutions of the London office, based apparently mostly around the youth wing of the Brotherhood. Sources say that Yusuf al-Qaradawi, the late Brotherhood cleric that Kyle also mentioned before, and some other leaders of the Union of Muslim Scholars made attempts to reunite these two factions, but these efforts so far showed no real sign of success. So there is no guarantee that this leadership competition will be solved. It might well result in a permanent split. More likely, however, whoever will make sure to have bigger funding and a stronger network will win. Also, in this situation, I would be surprised to know that the Brotherhood is not aware of its current weakness. So it seems unlikely that they are willing to become two separate groups, which would obviously increase this weakness. It is important to understand anyway that this crisis is already momentous, even without taking into account further possible outcomes of this disagreement, because their image and reputation for incompetence, murky financial behavior and money laundering, for example, as in the case of Tunisia, is already widespread, other than this internal disagreement. So we can easily say that this is the worst crisis of the Brotherhood that the Brotherhood experienced on an international level since its foundation in 1928. And there are no strong signs that they are taking steps to solve it effectively. Again, in Morocco, for instance, the Justice and Development Party related to the Brotherhood experienced huge defeats in the latest elections, especially in the parliamentary elections. In Jordan, the state is becoming harsher on the Brotherhood, with whom it had historically enjoyed a better situation, a better relation than now. They attempted a message to stop their sort of organizational ambiguity. So without the complete rupture that the movement had with the state as in Egypt, still there are signs of tension even in other countries. In the last few years also, the protests in Algeria and Sudan did not really have any strong political Islam component, which is a big change, is a momentous change compared to the recent past of these countries. So things are changing, and the Brotherhood galaxy seems to be struggling to keep pace with these changes. Besides the political outcomes of the MB experiences anyway, one of the most complex areas when dealing with the Brotherhood, and that we still have to monitor now that the situation is evolving, relates to their discourses and narratives. Here, quickly, I want to mention some key principles that we need when approaching this topic. The first is the so-called doublespeak. I'm sure it will come up even in my colleagues and the other panelists' intervention. But meantime, what do we mean by doublespeak? When speaking to mainstream audiences, these kind of movements present themselves as moderate reformers. When speaking to Islamists, they praise violent concepts or at least violent interpretations of them. In the past, other than mainstream versus specific audiences, the difference was also between Arabic content and content released in other languages. Now this gap obviously is narrower as communication is more pervasive and audiences can simply go and verify more easily what is being said elsewhere. Obviously, the doublespeak undermines trust between Muslims and non-Muslims. The second set of narratives related to Islamophobia and fosters the notorious discourse of victimhood carried out by the Brotherhood and MB-like groups. So not necessarily the Brotherhood as an official movement. Let's highlight that. A lot of valuable research has been carried out about this topic, so I will not waste your time on it. Let me just say that some Western powers and institutions still struggle sometimes with a sort of toxic form of politically correctness, based on which, if you say that political Islam plays with narratives of victimhood, it means that you are overlooking the real struggles of Muslims worldwide. That's just not the case. Denouncing victimhood narratives means denouncing the discourse that portrays Muslims as victims only for confrontational purposes, and to reaffirm the incompatibility of Muslim values with Western societies. So addressing the victimhood narratives as a problem means addressing the venues and the moments in which they are used for a specific instrumental purpose. The third key notion is gradualism. Political Islam rarely demands a violent dismantlement of institutions. More often, gradualism and ability to adapt, wait, and somehow disguise are employed for long-term goals, such as becoming the only interlocutors of the powers, the legislative powers especially, and the only representative of Muslim communities that are falsely portrayed as homogeneous, especially in the West. They are far from being homogeneous, obviously. So gradualism becomes crucial to pursue their tamkin, the accomplishing and actualization phase. We saw until now that the Brotherhood was already going through a difficult phase before the death of his spiritual leader, Yusuf al-Qaradawi. With this event, the changes seem to be even bigger and most likely faster. Obviously, they lost a spiritual guide and a reference point. All international Brotherhood organizations, without exception, published messages after his death and mourned for the death of al-Qaradawi. Let's remember that this happened in spite of his insistence on disengaging from the organization until the end of his life, at least formally. My perspective, however, is that yes, they lost a spiritual reference point, a spiritual guide, but they also lost a sort of bulky presence, a sort of old burden, and that the contemporary young constituency of the Brotherhood might feel somehow relieved without his presence. The new guard, especially in the West, has been trying to renew its image for some years now, and tries to be more and more appealing to Western interlocutors, institutions, and donors. So getting rid of someone who was famous for a number of controversial statements and positions might make this strategy easier, might play the new guard's perspective. Al-Qaradawi was famous for his extremist statements, including saying that Islam will invade Europe, as even peacefully, but still describing Hitler as a divine punishment for the sins of the Jews, declaring that he would love to end his life in the service of jihad and entering Israel to drop a bomb, calls to kill Jews and launch attacks, both on American forces, military forces, and civilians in Iraq. So moving beyond these positions, at least publicly, will likely help polishing the Muslim Brotherhood image further and the image of groups loosely linked to the Brotherhood. More problematic will be trying to renew their message in Muslim majority countries in which the Brotherhood is more conservative, even as far as its image is concerned. But the Arab political culture now everywhere is moving beyond religious legitimization. So political Islam needs to find something more, something better to offer if it wants to survive or to remain as strong as possible, at least. All over the MENA region, parties that put religion into governance and governance into religion are no longer as welcome as before. So of course, Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, Sudan are all different, and to say that political Islam declined or is declining everywhere in the same way would be simplistic. We are not saying that. But still, all the movements under this umbrella are showing common negative trends. Historically, also, the Brotherhood has always been, I would say, amazing in being an opposition force, not in building something. So obviously poverty, social and economic marginalization, lack of education will always represent a fertile ground for their kinds of narrative. But things are becoming more and more complicated for them. And the Brotherhood in the MENA region does not seem to be capable of undertaking a credible renewal, at least as of today. Islamist parties are having a hard time to understand that the disillusionment, the disenfranchisement of many Muslims against political Islam is not a Western conspiracy, is not a product of Western influence. On the contrary, it is the result of the thought and the education of millions of Muslims who are perfectly capable of assessing politics and judging what happens in their countries without necessarily having Western support. I was reading a few weeks ago, for example, that deism, so the belief in God, but not in religion, is on the rise in the entire MENA region, which is an interesting trend worth researching further. In the West, there are partial attempts to slow down this trend of disenfranchisement from political Islam. Western Muslim organizations and advocacy groups are heading towards a gradual secularization, maybe is too strong, let's say diversification and broadening of their actions and instances in an attempt to present themselves as a social force capable of protecting the rights of everyone, especially minorities. In these directions, we can find daily calls against racism, discrimination, the far right, and they are more and more common. So without mentioning here any specific organization, you can notice this trend just browsing their websites worldwide daily. Of course, this looks commendable, but one has to see if the reason behind these efforts is the willingness to be more accepted, to receive funding and to be the government's interlocutors in the West, or if it is based on a real project of renewal, and there are reasons to be quite doubtful about it. Also, we have to remember that this trend occurs in the framework of new attempts by a number of Western governments to strengthen, when not to build from scratch, local forms of religiosity and Islam. This is exactly what France is doing with the new Forum of Islam in France and what some governments are working on. And it will be very interesting to see how the older ways of experiencing Islam between the MENA region and the West will influence the new ways in Europe, in the US, in Canada, and vice versa. It will be crucial to understand the political game that political Islam intrinsically plays very often. When it tries to establish its basis in peaceful ways and influence politics in the name of their understanding of Islam, they do so using the liberal constitutions that give them the right to participate, give them the right to do so. At the same time, however, and here lies the political game, democratic systems include principles that political Islam is usually not willing to accept or to protect. I'm thinking about the right to change religion, freedom of choices regarding complete freedom regarding sexual life, etc. So, and I've said this before, and I'm not the only one, of course, the decision makers, on the decision maker side, the problem is often not having bad intentions when dealing with political Islam. It's more often a lasting ignorance of Islam as a religion and of political Islam dynamics. And that's why it is always necessary to keep monitoring the evolution within political Islam in its pure meaning and in the loosely linked organizations, movements, and institutions in the West and in the MENA region. Thank you so much. I think I'm done in my time.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I think it's off to a great start. Go to John for the next 10 or 15 minutes.
Well, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the Brotherhood movements here in the United States, which I'm a lot more familiar with than in Europe. I think that one thing to remember is the 2017 UK parliamentary report on the Muslim Brotherhood. It noted that the Brotherhood relies on tactics. When it participates in democratic processes, where it can get its ways through, electoral processes, it will do so. If it finds its way obstructed, as it did, following the overthrow of Morsi in Egypt in 2013, it will resort to violence or a mixture of both. Because in my research for a book called The Arab Spring Ruse, How the Muslim Brotherhood Duped Washington in Libya and Syria, I found that in many cases, the nonviolent, political arm of the global, jihadist movement, worked in many cases behind the scenes in Libya and Syria with the violent ones. You had in Syria, you had militias that were aligned with the Brotherhood that openly were involved with supporting Jabhat al-Nusra, al-Qaeda's arm in Syria prior to its break off. You had the pro-Brotherhood Erdogan government providing assistance to these groups in Syria and also in Libya. I found one of the things I found also is here in the United States, the Muslim Brotherhood has achieved its long-term goal of becoming mainstream. It's become just another part of the rainbow coalition of the Democratic Party in the U.S. You see, its mark in the Democratic Party's embrace of Jamal Khashoggi, and it's placing him as a voice for free speech. What happened to him in Turkey was heinous and barbaric, but that doesn't change the fact that he was, a supporter of Abdullah Azzam, the Jordanian, Brotherhood leader who went to Afghanistan in the 80s and became a leader of global jihadism, and arguably the progenitor of the Taliban. We have the Muslim President Biden, as a result of Khashoggi, shifting up 180 degrees toward the U.S.'s stance towards Saudi Arabia, trying to treat Saudi Arabia as a pariah, and that's really coming to harm the United States in economic matters with the gas pump here in the U.S. You have, as a result of Karadawi's death, every single major Brotherhood faction or front group, like the Council on American Islamic Relations, Muslim American Society, Islamic Circle of North America, all coming out and praising him, sort of like the mask drop. I mean, at the same time, the Brotherhood groups have managed to elect congressmen like Andre Carson, like Rashid Tlaib, like Ilhan Omar, and they've and also members of state legislatures and so forth across the country, which had been one of the Brotherhood group's goals here in the United States. And another thing that I found as a result of my research into the Arab Spring is that the Brotherhood group here in the United States played a key and important role in organizing the Obama administration to get behind intervention in Libya and getting behind intervention in Syria. I mean, another way to show the power of the Brotherhood lobby in the United States is something called the Libya Stabilization Act, which really is aimed at punishing Marshal Haftar and the elected House of Representatives in Libya, and in favor of the Tripoli faction that has a very strong connection with the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, Khalid al-Mishri, who is the state chairman in Tripoli, is closely linked with the Libyan American Alliance here in the United States, which is dominated by Muslim Brotherhood people. So I think that unlike in Europe, where you have more of a separatist dimension of the Brotherhood has shown, as Sarah said, in the start, the ability to adapt to circumstances. I mean, it has become part of the woke movement, which is not really going to possibly be well for them, because there's a growing backlash among Muslims and non-Muslims alike to this politically correct movement. I mean, we're seeing it come out in our midterm elections here in the United States. I mean, just as we saw a couple of weeks ago in Sweden and Italy. I mean, Sweden particularly is concerned about the Islamic separatism and migration. But I think that we're seeing here in the United States that it's become part and parcel of the political landscape. I mean, when I started looking at the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is the key Brotherhood lobby here in the United States 10 years ago, it wasn't anywhere near as mainstream as it's become today. I mean, you have Brotherhood-linked, imams and clerics who are routinely invited to Democratic Party events. And one thing I thought was kind of interesting back in 2019 was you had the Council on American Islamic Relations call out a mayor of Prospect Park, New Jersey, who was close to the governor of Democratic governor of New Jersey. Well, when you went looking deeper into his background, he had been involved with IHH and a bunch of other Brotherhood-linked charities that had been providing assistance to Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria. So it's a tangled web. I think that it's really, hard in some ways to, disseminate the, violent from the non-violent. I mean, it's more like, Hezbollah, which has its political wing and its military wing. Or like the Irish Republican Army back in the early in the 20th century, which had Sinn Féin, which was its political wing, and its military wing. I think that's sort of the way that you need to look at it, because if you look at Carradale himself, now he oversaw something. He oversaw a network of charities that included people who were fundraising for Al Qaeda, as well as Hamas. And you found the International African Arab Relief, here in the United States. You had Muslim Brotherhood figures indicted and imprisoned for fundraising for Al Qaeda. So they'll talk publicly saying that we're against violence, but privately, they'll use the language that's virtually indistinguishable. We had one imam at Dar al-Hijra Islamic Center just outside of Washington, D.C., where the 9/11 hijackers attend, talking about Muslim men being first in line, last in line for everything except for arms for jihad. So it's kind of hard in my mind to separate them. They're good at putting out a front. They've mainstreamed themselves. You have they've managed to use the Islamophobia narrative to get people outside of the Muslim community, especially among liberals, to stop looking at what they're doing. Or otherwise, they'll use right-wing extremists to say, oh, the Muslim Brotherhood isn't any worse than some of these Christian radical groups. I think that's, in summary, I think that, we have to look at some of the complexities here, because you find a lot of cases, the so-called nonviolent folks have been active in funding and providing logistical support to the violent groups. I think that sums up my comments.
Thank you very much. The audience can put questions in the chat if they want me to ask them, or if otherwise they can ask their own. I can turn the camera to them. So the first question I was going to ask was about the decline of the Brotherhood in the region. And in a sense, whether you think that will be a lasting fact, because the Brotherhood, its narrative is that in the region, religion and the state are not separate, and that has a fairly wide appeal. Most people don't recognize that distinction. So, but obviously there is an increasing movement that says there should be a distinction between the state and the faith. In a sense, do you think that those people will prevail, or that at some point the Brotherhood will be able to make a comeback as part of a kind of backlash to this movement? If we go to Sarah first.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. It's also quite complex. As we said, yes, the religion and governance are still not separate, as we all know. But at the same time, as we were saying before, there is an increasingly stronger trend to decide to actually separate them, if not from a top-down perspective, at least from a bottom-up perspective. So as far as people's instances are concerned and are involved. Also, the progressive drifting away from political Islam can come from another reason, which is not a sort of secularization, bottom up or top down, etc., but is the failure of the bottom up Islamization of political Islam. So basically, more and more people, especially in times of crisis, were willing to just to accept what Sigrid was saying, al-Islam huwa al-hal, so the Islam is the solution, as long as Islam or political Islam was providing them with something, basic service, education, the kind of on-the-ground welfare that governments sometimes in Middle Eastern history were not willing to or unable of providing for them. But if even this component of political Islam falls apart or narrows so much, then I don't see why the same amount of people would still keep loyal and to the cause or faithful to these kind of movements, even on the ground. So the process of drifting away from political Islam, maybe I'm being too optimistic, but I think can move in these two directions. One, for a progressive abandonment of political Islam as an ideology and a progressive secularization of the worldviews, I would say, and one because they just failed to provide on the ground what they promised to. I hope I answered.
Thank you, Sarah. Mr. John.
I think that the Muslim Brotherhood as a movement has pretty much discredited itself in the region of its origin. I mean, as a result of promises of delivering competent services, being an improvement over the secular dictatorships that they replaced during the Arab Spring, as we've seen in Tunisia, as we've seen widespread corruption, a failure to deliver services. You've also seen the support for violent uprisings across the region create a cognitive dissonance for the people, because they thought that they're going to have some sort of utopian vision, but instead Syria is in shambles, Libya is in shambles. I mean, all the political Islam managed to do was kill hundreds of thousands of people. And I think that you're also, this isn't the Brotherhood, but look in Iran right now, where you're seeing a repudiation of Islamism there. I think that it's a really uphill battle for the Muslim Brotherhood to regain what it had on the eve of the Arab Spring, because it failed to deliver. It failed to provide a moral leadership that it had promised, and now it's being forced into being it's more influential now in Europe and America than in the places it came from. I think that the Muslim Brotherhood faces a similar situation today as Europe faced following the 30 Years' War, where the idea of religious purity and left lots of people dead and people scratching their heads at the end of it all. Is religion really worth it? I mean, as Sarah was talking about, there is a growing secular, disaffiliation, or I guess maybe quietism is the best term, toward, they don't want radical separation of mosque and state or anything of that sort, but they're less likely to support a kind of revolutionary Islamic solution because it failed to deliver.
Thank you. We are unfortunately running out of time, so this will be the last question. And if you want to add on any concluding remarks, by all means do so. So having asked about the Brotherhood in the region, we pick up where you left off with the Brotherhood in the West. Essentially, what do you think of these efforts in France and Austria and other places to curb the influence of the Brotherhood within, that's essentially operating within the law? In other words, it's it is a social and societal effort to downgrade the Brotherhood, to stop it spreading, to focus on social cohesion, as I say, which is quite different from what has happened over the last decade and more, which was a very strict focus on terrorism and terrorism finance and other things that, strictly speaking, broke the law. Do you think this is the right way to go, and how would you strengthen it if so? And if you think it's the wrong way, can you explain that too? Over to Sarah.
I personally believe it's partly the right way to do so. It's partly the right move. It's undoubtedly, I don't know if it's right or wrong, but it's brave. Somehow we can say it's brave, especially in Austria, partly in France, and I'm not aware of details, but I'm sure other Western governments and institutions are working on it. Again, as we were saying before, they are putting their bet on the growth and the support of local forms of Islam, obviously in order to be able to better control potential threats coming from there. So yeah, it can be the right way to do so. At the same time, there is a problem. We always have to think of how the Muslim communities would welcome this effort. So just presenting, this is something that can be applied also, for example, to counter extremism initiatives. If they are perceived by the Muslim communities as only carried out by a bunch of token men and women who are just the long hand of the state against Muslims or to control Muslims, well, they are bound to fail. If they are well structured, and this means a joint effort of good intelligence services, which exist, fortunately, in Europe, a good knowledge of Islam and political Islam, or Islamism, as we want to call them, and the work to find the right interlocutors within the communities, then yes, then this might be a success, or at least an interesting challenge for the future. The obstacles will be the usual ones. Mistrust, skepticism, as we were saying before, towards this kind of initiatives in the West, but also the flag of the freedom of speech, because every time you try to stop some kind of narratives and discourses, you end up arguing with people who think this is a vulnus and it's harmful for their freedom of speech. When it comes to proselytizing, I believe freedom of speech should just be put aside, and I'm saying this from a democratic perspective, not, of course, not from a reactionary one. Also, we tend to underestimate the fact that when I don't know, an imam or even a far-right extremist, I don't want to like I can generalize in this case, when these kind of figures are expelled, for instance, or deported, or they receive an order of leaving the territory of a country, intelligence services have evidence and collected proof of their of the potential threats they represent. They don't do that just on the basis of containing someone else's freedom of speech. So there are legal instruments to strike a balance between this abused notion of freedom of speech, in this case is abused, and public order and safety. We just have to be, again, brave enough to strike this balance somehow, and not always trying to co-opt people because they play your game.
Thank you very much. Professor John.
I think that countries in the West, I'm supportive of moves, whether we're talking in France or Austria, Sweden, elsewhere, to work to marginalize the Brotherhood because it serves as a force for social separatism. It's focuses on victimhood by working with people within the Muslim communities to work to mainstream them, work to integrate them into European societies, just as we have here in the United States, where Muslims are a integrated part of society. I think that a lot of the things the Brotherhood does is it relies on cries about racism, cries about discrimination, cries about separatism to radicalize people. I mean, that's where you end up getting a lot of these so-called homegrown jihadists that we've seen across Europe in the past decade or so. And also it's what ends up leading to a lot of resentment among native Europeans to the Muslim presence in their countries. I think I can see like with the Swedish elections, a lot of resentment against the perception that Muslims are freeloading off the Swedish welfare and society. And the Brotherhood fills a role of telling Muslims that they'll never be really European, and that Islam is the answer. And by Islam is the answer, it means the imposition of Sharia and all of these concepts and values that are run contrary to post-Enlightenment European society.
Thank you very much. Thank you to you all for contributing. And thank you to our audience for being here. We will be back soon. Bye-bye.